Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Corps. Today we're going to take a look at the Logitech Cloud. It's actually been over a year since I did my first review on this device, and a lot of things have changed. Number one, I'm still playing this thing all the time, but there's also been a bunch of software updates that really improve the experience. On top of that, we've had a bunch of other handhelds release on the market, and so it's always good to kind of take another look at some of these devices and see whether or not today they're still going to be worth it. So that's what I want to dive in this video here. We'll take a look at all the different updates, as well as the pros and cons that I had in my initial review, and see what's changed about it and whether or not it might be a good fit for you. Anyway, without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, to start, let's talk about what the Logitech G Cloud is in the first place. You've probably heard of Logitech as a brand before. They're mostly known for their mice and keyboards. However, the G Cloud is their very first handheld device. And it's an Android-based device that runs the Snapdragon 720G as its processor. That is kind of an older chipset at this point, so it's not really meant to be able to emulate and play games. It was mostly focused on using it for cloud gaming. And so if you look at the Logitech promotional materials, they'll talk a lot about how you can stream Xbox or PC games. You can even play Android games on it. But they don't really talk about the emulation potential, and so I am going to talk a little bit more about that here in this video. Another thing worth noting is the display. This is a 7-inch LCD panel with a 1080p resolution and a 16:9 aspect ratio. And that works really well, especially when it comes to streaming. It's a nice big size, but then also that 1080p resolution is a really good fit at 7 inches. Anyway, that's just a real quick look at the most important specs that I wanted to start with. If you want to learn more, I have my full review that I'll have linked down below. Now, in that review, I did talk about my pros and cons of the device, and so that's what I want to focus on here in this re-review. So looking at the things that I liked and didn't like about it, I actually want to go over the cons first, because some of these have actually been amended. And right out of the gate, I don't think you can talk about the Logitech Cloud without talking about its price. The retail price is still $350. That was ridiculous last year, and it's even worse today. Now, thankfully, if you go on Best Buy or Amazon, they've basically permanently discounted it down to $299, but all the same, $299 for this device is still really high. In fact, just earlier this week, I did a video talking about the Retro Pocket 4 and the 4 Pro, and at $199, the 4 Pro can run circles around this in terms of performance, but it's $100 cheaper. And so I think the price point here is still really off. And this price point is still the reason why I actively do not recommend getting this device when anyone asks me what handheld they should get. After all, at $300, you've got a ton of different options, including now the Odin 2 starting price, but then also you're not that far off from the Steam Deck either. And really, this price point has always been a big red flag for me. I fully expected this device to get around $199 at some point, just because I think that's the sweet spot when it comes to the supply and demand, but unfortunately, it just hasn't got there yet. There have been sales from time to time, but all the same, it's been keeping pretty steady at around $299, maybe $250 here and there. Now, there are ways to get it cheaper if you don't mind compromising and getting a used copy. So for example, just a quick search on eBay finds a bunch of different options at around $199. And so if you are looking at around that price point, I still think that it is going to be worth it right around there, but I'm still not able to recommend it for anything over $199. So you do have to shop around in order to get one at a good deal. Anyway, that's the big elephant in the room, so I think we've already addressed that. Let's move on to the other factors that were cons previously that I want to talk about. So next we have the D-pad diagonals, and unfortunately there's not really been any change in this regard. And what I'm talking about here is that pushing on a diagonal on this device is actually pretty hard. There's not a lot of pivot to the D-pad, and so as a result, when you're trying to hit one of those diagonal movements, it is not very simple to do. You can definitely do it if you mash down on it, but it doesn't feel very natural. To give you an example, here is the Contra test. This is where I push down on the D-pad and then rock it left and right. And my goal here is to get the character to move a little bit. That means that I can hit a diagonal when I want to, but then not when I don't. And you can see here, unfortunately, no matter how much I rock it back and forth, the character doesn't move at all. That means that it is a little bit too hard to hit the diagonals. Another test I like to do is with a Street Fighter game. So here I'm going to try to use a Fireball and a Dragon Punch, and you can see here it is basically impossible. If I really mash down on it, yes, I can pull off that move, but again, it just doesn't feel natural. And so in this case, I would rather just use a joystick, which is something I often will not do with a Street Fighter game. I grew up playing these games on the Super Nintendo, and so I've always preferred to use a D-pad. And so I would say that this D-pad is still not Hadoukenable or Shoryukenable. On top of that, when it comes to certain platforming games where diagonal inputs are required, Celeste is an excellent example. This one also doesn't work out very well. There are many times when I want to do a diagonal and instead my character goes straight or goes straight up. Now, thankfully, the analog sticks on this device are actually pretty great. They are a fairly large size for the size of the device, and I've always found the sticks to be fairly precise. In fact, there's now a software update where you can go in and you can adjust the profile to find whatever is going to match you the best. And so as long as you don't mind using an analog stick instead of a D-pad with certain games, I think it's a non-issue. It's really going to come down to what types of games you're playing and whether or not you really prefer to use a D-pad in those scenarios. Either way, those two are the big negatives about the Logitech Cloud. The price is still kind of unacceptable. And then also, if you want to play specifically D-pad centric games, it's not going to be a perfect fit. Now let's talk about some of the other negatives, which I think have kind of turned into positives. The next one up is going to be video out. And as you already saw from a little bit of the footage that I was just teasing, yes, video out works on this device now. In fact, the software update came out about 2 months ago, and so now you get video out via USB-C. And there's many different ways you can do this. You could get a USB-C adapter out to HDMI, or in my case, I'm using a USB-C dock that actually can plug in from the bottom. Now there's not a lot of options here. For example, the resolution is going to be 1080p with a 16:9 output, and that's because it's mirroring the screen. In fact, when you plug it up, it's going to still show the screen on the device. There's no way to turn that off, at least as far as I could tell. But all the same, I think it's a pretty neat concept to be able to plug this into a dock or just into an adapter and then be able to play on a big screen TV. All you have to do is just then hook it up to a Bluetooth controller and all of a sudden you've consoleized this device. And this was something that was not available previously, but now it is. And so I love the fact that we have this new feature available because of software update. Another feature that wasn't there at launch but was added later is a keymapper. So a keymapper is basically when you have a game that's playing that only has touchscreen controls, but you want to use the controls that are on the Logitech Cloud. What this does is it mimics those touch inputs but assigns it to a button. And that's now available in their software. You do have to go into the settings and enable it at first, but after that it's as simple as just holding onto the home button when you're playing an Android game, and then within these settings there will be an option to turn on the keymapper. From there it's a very simple configuration. You basically will just move around your controls to wherever you want them on the touchscreen, and then once you save that configuration you're good to go. So the game that I'm testing right here does not have any inbuilt controller support at all. But after you configure the keymapper, it's working out great. And so if you have any games like this that are in the same kind of scenario, this might be a great solution. Okay, let's keep going down the line talking about the things I didn't like about the Logitech Cloud when I first reviewed it. And next up is going to be the internal storage. It's only 64 gigabytes. Again, this is a device that's made for cloud gaming, and so you don't need a lot of onboard storage, but all the same, that is very small compared to other devices on the market. And a big limitation here with the 64 gigabytes is going to be playing Android games. So if you want to play anything that has a large file size, Genshin Impact, Call of Duty, that's going to start eating up that storage pretty quickly. And of course, this is something that hasn't changed. It's still 64 gigabytes here today. However, it does have an SD card slot, but one of the limitations here, and actually the next thing I didn't like about the device, is that the file format is limited to FAT32. And the reason why this matters is because FAT32 is limited to 4 gigabyte files. That means if you are using a larger emulated file, specifically when it comes to PlayStation 2 or Nintendo Switch, you're not going to be able to put it on the SD card because it's not going to be allowed with FAT32. So in particular, if you're trying to play a PS2 game that's rather large, something like God of War 2, which I think is around 6 gigabytes, you're not going to be able to play it on this device. Now, performance-wise, you're not going to be able to play it anyway, but it's always good to have as many options as possible, and the FAT32 file system does limit it quite a bit. And this honestly was something that I was expecting to see in a software update, but unfortunately it never came. Now, that's all the negative things that I have about the device, and like I mentioned, a couple of these have turned into positives because they are features that are now available. But all the same, I did want to knock these out first, and if you're still here watching the video, now we get into the fun stuff where I talk about all the reasons why I like the Logitech Cloud and why I keep using it even 1 year later. So next we're going to move over to the left side of the page, talk about the things that I liked about the Logitech Cloud during my first review, and then a couple others that I've added since then. So to start, let's talk about the build quality and ergonomics. Number one, this is a very solid feeling handheld. It just feels like it's like one connected piece of plastic. It's very nice to hold in the hands. And the other main reason why it's so nice to hold are the ergonomics. In fact, I still think this is some of the best ergonomics available on any handheld bar none. In fact, the only devices that I find to be more comfortable than this one are the Steam Deck and the ROG Ally. Everything else comes underneath the Logitech Cloud. And there's a few reasons for it, but number one is the fact that it just feels like it was designed with human hands in mind. And that sounds kind of silly, but if you've ever tried a lot of these handhelds, you know that sometimes they make these to look really cool on a spec sheet and maybe in their promotion materials, but when you actually get them in the hand and you start playing them for an hour, it's not the best ergonomic design. But somehow with the Logitech Cloud, they nailed it with their first device. I think it has to do with maybe the fact that Logitech engineers have already worked with other ergonomic things like mice, but all the same, it is pretty impressive. The device itself has a lot of rounded corners to it and really big grips here at the bottom, and the device itself has a nice teardrop kind of shape to it. As a result, it's just very naturally ergonomic. To put it simply, this is a device that I can easily play for hours on end, and that is a rare feat when it comes to some of these handhelds. In fact, I'm going to add a couple additions right here just because it's a good place to put them. Number one is the fact that this device is so lightweight. Now, the total weight of this is 463 grams, which is almost exactly 1 pound. Now, that seems like a lot, but you have to remember that this is a rather big device, and so because of that, the weight is distributed across the whole thing. And when you compare it to other devices around the same size, like the Steam Deck or the ROG Ally, this is about 2/3 of that weight. And so as a result, you have a device that's rather large with nice distributed weight that just feels like easy to hold. Now, the other benefit that I wanted to add right here about the Logitech Cloud is the fact that it runs very cool. It's passively cooled, so it means that there's no fan or anything else like that, but all the same, it still doesn't overheat. In fact, there is never any ambient heat coming from the device when I'm playing it. And so my big point here is that yes, the build quality is excellent, the ergonomics are good, and there's many reasons why I like playing this device for many hours on end. Now, the next point was availability, and the point I was making here is when it first came out, it was the only handheld that you could walk into a store like Best Buy and actually pick up. Now that's changed. For example, you can buy the ROG Ally and the Lenovo Legion Go, but at the time that was pretty awesome. It's still a thing right now, which is pretty cool, but at the same time, there are other devices where you can do that. All the same, it is pretty neat to be able to buy this from Amazon or Best Buy and have it in just a day or two. Next up is the display, which is 1080p and 7 inches, like I mentioned before. Not a lot has changed about that, other than the fact that I think it's still the perfect size for a 1080p resolution. It's the same one that we found on the PlayStation Portal in terms of resolution and size, which is really impressive there, and so it's the same kind of added benefit right here. And I also think it's just a good screen overall. It's got a nice color balance to it, it's nice and rich and vibrant, and then also it can get pretty bright and dim depending on the environment you're playing in. Okay, next point is the streaming capability, and I'm a little bit mixed about this one, but definitely skewed more towards positive. Number one, the negative thing here is that it's a 5 gigahertz connection. And while I found that to be decent when it comes to streaming both in my home as well as with the internet, I think that Wi-Fi 6 would have been a little bit better, especially for a device that's supposed to be geared more towards streaming. Now, that being said, when it comes to streaming, it's still a very positive experience. I mostly will use it for Xbox streaming. That can be either remote play with my local Xbox, but then also you can use Game Pass on it as well, so you can stream from the cloud. And I think that's a really nice service, especially if you don't own an Xbox. You can just pay $20 a month or whatever it is for Game Pass, and then you have access to all of these games that you can stream right then and there. Cloud saves, all that other stuff are going to be dedicated within there, and on a 7-inch display, the games are going to look great. Now, for my part, Game Pass hasn't been perfect. After all, I live in Hawaii, and so I've got a big distance between me and these servers, and so I just get a lot of lag no matter what when trying to play Game Pass, and unfortunately, the Logitech Cloud is no different in that regard. However, if you're on like the US mainland or just on a continent and not on an island, then you will probably have a much better time than me. Now, you can also use this for remote play with a PS4 or a PS5. Unfortunately, you can't use the official PlayStation Remote app, at least with the inbuilt controls, but you've got a couple third-party solutions you can use. There's a free app called Chiaki, and then there's a paid one called PS Play, and that's the one I end up using. Either way, when it comes to home console streaming or remote play, you've got quite a few options. And in addition to that, if you want to do any sort of local PC streaming, you can do that as well. So for example, if you've got a nice gaming PC and you have it loaded up with Steam, you can use the Steam Link app to stream from one to the other. And you've got a lot of other app options besides Steam Link, for example, Moonlight or Parsec. Now, in addition to the local remote play you can do with your PC there in your house, you can also use cloud servers very similar to Game Pass, but with something called NVIDIA GeForce Now. And this one's kind of similar to Game Pass in that you don't need to own a PC. You're actually streaming from some other PC that's owned by NVIDIA. But bear in mind, you need to own the games first. So you'll have to connect it with your Steam or your Epic Game Store account, and then you can stream those games as long as they're compatible with it. So either way, when it comes to streaming, yes, you have all the same options that we did a year ago, and they all still work very well. Okay, so moving down the line here, the next aspect I want to talk about are going to be the rumble and haptics. And this is a big positive for me. It feels really subtle and just kind of 3D feeling. It's hard to explain and kind of convey in a video like this, but all the same, the thing that it reminds me the most of is a DualSense controller. It has a really subtle kind of rumble feel to it. I don't like really strong rumble motors, and this one is just kind of perfectly tuned in that regard. And so if you think about, hooking up a phone to a controller or even using one of those retro handhelds, typically it's just going to make everything shake. And yes, that's going to give you that rumble feedback, but that's very different on the Logitech Cloud. Instead, it just feels a little bit more intuitive and almost 3D in kind of the scope of it. Another positive with the device is the audio. Now, it has down-firing speakers, but the way that you hold it and kind of cup it in your hands, it makes the sound kind of bounce back off of your hands and then into your ears. And so it's definitely not the same as a front-firing speaker, so it's not like top-notch, but all the same, it is still surprisingly good for being down-firing. Okay, and then finally, my last bullet in my previous video was the fact that the emulation performance was surprisingly good. So let's do a quick test against all of that stuff one more time. Number one, when it comes to retro gaming, playing 8-bit and 16-bit era stuff, this is all going to play great. In fact, because we have such a large display, even though it is running in a 4:3 aspect ratio for most of these systems, it's still going to look really good. And that's because the screen overall is relatively large. The only minor quibble I have when it comes to classic gaming are the buttons. These actually bottom out a little bit more than I would like. What that means is that when you fully press down on the button, it kind of goes flush with the shell. And I don't really like that feeling. I wish there was a little bit more height to it. And so that's one little nitpick I would have when it comes to perfect classic gaming. But all the same, I think when it comes to 8-bit and 16-bit era games, you're going to have a great time. Another system that plays really well on this device is Game Boy Advance. That one has a little bit wider of an aspect ratio, and so as a result, it fills up more of the screen. And playing these games on a 7-inch display like this is really impressive. Now, I think it's kind of assumed that yes, the Logitech Cloud would be able to play classic retro games, but what always surprises me about it is that the performance here is actually not so bad considering the fact that we have such an old chip inside. So moving on to the harder systems, we'll start with Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast. These can all be upscaled to a 1080p resolution and play most games at a full speed. There are going to be some every once in a while you'll have to drop down to a 720p resolution, for example with GoldenEye, but for the most part when it comes to this era of gaming, you'll be able to upscale most of these to a 1080p resolution and they look excellent. Another system I think is just out of this world with this device is PlayStation Portable. Most games will run at a 4x resolution, which is a full 1080p, and playing these games at a 7-inch screen, 16:9 aspect ratio, 1080p resolution, all that combines into a really good PlayStation Portable experience. In fact, this is still one of my favorite ways to play PlayStation Portable, even though I have like 100 plus of these handhelds at this point. Now, it's not going to be perfect. There are some games that will require some settings tweaks. For example, God of War Chains of Olympus, you actually have to run this one at a 2x resolution to get perfect performance. But even then, it's still totally playable on the Logitech Cloud. So the PSP is kind of that one system I think that really shines on the Logitech Cloud altogether. So now let's move into the systems that will not play 100% on this device, but you might be pleasantly surprised. We'll start with Nintendo 3DS. Now this one I had to do a couple hacks. For example, I'm using the Citra MMJ app. And this one is not quite as accurate as the official one, but it gives you better performance. And I found that if you play most games at a 1x resolution, you can actually get some pretty good performance here. And so like with all the other systems I'll be talking about for the rest of the video, I would not buy this device specifically to emulate Nintendo 3DS, but all the same, it is a pleasant surprise when many of these games will actually play fairly well. Moving on from there, let's talk about Nintendo GameCube. I'm going to use the official Dolphin app because that one has made a lot of changes that have improved the performance on it over the past year. And I found that performance here is a little bit better than the T618 devices. That's going to include things like the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus. I've done a bunch of videos about this chipset previously. And in those other videos, I said that you can usually get about 50% of the games to work okay, not perfectly, but at least to the point where I would consider it to be mostly playable. However, you do have to bear in mind that there are a couple tweaks that need to happen. Number one, instead of just using your typical NTSC ROMs, I recommend using PAL ROMs. Those ran at a 50 frames per second, which means that it's going to be easier on the emulator to get to a full speed. And so in my testing, I mostly tried out PAL ROMs and then played everything at the native 1x resolution. And so yeah, I would say for about 50 or 60% of games, they're going to be mostly playable if you use those PAL ROMs and you're okay with a little bit of slowdown or stuttering here and there. Again, I wouldn't buy this for GameCube, but it's still a nice surprise when you can play your favorite game on here. And it's very similar setting with PlayStation 2. Again, I'm using the PAL ROMs and at a 1x resolution, but I was actually surprised that some of these games actually played better than on GameCube. So here I was able to play games like God Hand and Grand Theft Auto but with widescreen hacks turned on to fill up the whole screen, again with a 1x resolution, but man, it still looked really good. And so if anything, when it comes to GameCube and PS2, I would say, if you want to focus on lightweight games, role-playing games, 2D games, most of those are going to work fine. But when you get to those heavy hitters, yeah, unfortunately, it's not going to work. A good example here is going to be Burnout Revenge on PlayStation 2. This one at a 1x resolution only plays at about 2/3 speed. Now, of course, there are other hacks you can do like underclocking and things like that to try to eke out even more performance. But all the same, I wanted to give you a reasonable expectation of how many of these games you'll be able to play. And I think somewhere between 50 and 60% is probably going to be about right. So the last system I wanted to talk about when it comes to emulation is going to be Nintendo Switch. And this one is pretty hit and miss. Number one, the only app that's available on Android that's in active development are the Yuzu apps. They have the early access as well as the regular one. Now, the development team behind Yuzu has been focusing mostly on the high-end Android chips. And so as a result, some of these low-powered systems like the Logitech Cloud have been left behind. And so unfortunately, even though I tried many different versions of this app, as well as different graphics backends and all these other settings tweaks, I couldn't get a single Switch game to boot within Yuzu. And so that is definitely a bummer, but maybe later on down the line, this will get better compatibility with this particular chipset. However, one thing to bear in mind is the Skyline app, which stopped its development about 6 months ago at this point, still actually works really well with the Logitech Cloud. In particular, I think that indie games are going to run really well. And so I've actually had a surprisingly good time when it comes to playing those lightweight Switch games on the Logitech Cloud. A lot of that has to do with the size of the screen and the fact that it has a 16:9 aspect ratio. It's really a perfect fit when it comes to those Switch games. And so in a nutshell, yes, I think that emulation on the Logitech Cloud, a device that was never meant to emulate, is still surprisingly good. In fact, it's gotten a little bit better over the past year, mostly because of the development work that's happened on a lot of these Android apps. And so I've mostly been using the Logitech G Cloud for emulation. I've loaded up the Daijisho front end, which will kind of organize all my systems. I can tab through them and then launch my games from here. I've got a full setup guide for Android and Daijisho, which I'll leave linked down below. And so that's been my number one use case with the Logitech Cloud. Probably about 75% of my time I'm doing that. The other 25% of the time is when I'm using remote play within my house. So I'm streaming my own Xbox or PlayStation 5 directly onto the Logitech Cloud, if I want to go to bed and maybe play a little bit before I go to sleep. Now, one quick tip I want to mention, if you do want to do remote play with the Xbox, I would recommend using a third-party app called XBX Play. This is the same app developer as the PS Play one that I mentioned before. Now, this one is paid. I think it's around $6 like the PlayStation version. But the reason why I recommend this over the official Xbox app is because this one will default to 1080p resolution. The Xbox app will actually give you a 720p resolution, so you'll get a better looking display if you use the XBX Play app, and so I do recommend that one. And of course, I'll leave links down to those apps below in case you want to check them out. Okay, so that's the big meat of this video. I wanted to talk about all the bad and good that comes with this device and what things have changed over the past year. Now I want to segue into whether or not this is going to be worth buying here and now. And of course, like with all my videos, it's a very subjective thing. It's a decision that's left up to you and your budget and your use case, but I hope I've kind of spelled that out a little bit better, at least in terms of what you can do with the Logitech Cloud. So here's the way I see it. When I first bought this device back last year, it really hurt. I couldn't believe that I was spending $350 on a device. And honestly, if I didn't have a channel where I reviewed these kind of things, I probably wouldn't have bought it at all. That's just really expensive for what you're getting. However, I think one of the most important parts of buying any sort of tech product is the value that you get out of it afterwards. And so yes, it may be a big ticket item, but if you use it so much that you feel like you get your money's worth, then yeah, it might be worth it. And here's the thing, the Logitech Cloud for me is still way too expensive at $350 or even $300. I think it should be a $200 device. That being said, I paid $350+ for it, and I don't regret it. Like, it's a device that I use all the time, and I feel like I have earned my money back. And I do find that a little bit surprising coming from me, given the fact that I own so many of these devices, right? I have some that are so much cheaper, so much more expensive, but all the same, I tend to grab the Logitech Cloud. There's a couple reasons for that. Number one is the fact that I can play a lot of the emulated systems that I like on it, but then just swap over to remote play or streaming if I want. And then also the battery life on this is really good. It's actually something that I probably should have put in one of those bullet points. You can get on average about 12 hours of battery life with this thing. It's kind of ridiculous. I never really realized it when I was first playing it just because I was pushing the emulation really hard. But when it comes down to it, in just my everyday use case, I'm kind of going back and forth. And so as a result, when you're streaming, it's not really going to take that much juice at all. But then when you're pushing the emulation, sure, it might. But as I do a mixture of it, I found that about 12 hours is going to be my average. And so that's been a really great experience in the fact that I don't have to worry about charging this thing every single day. In fact, I just kind of play it till it gets down to about 20%, which can take maybe a week, and then I will plug it up, charge it up, and then be ready to go for the following week after that. So I guess here's the way I see it. If you can grab this device for around the $200 price point, I do think at that point it is going to be kind of worth it. There are other devices that are more powerful for cheaper, but all the same, there's nothing that has this really excellent balance between ergonomics, screen size, and just kind of the ability to play many different things at once. So in wrapping up, I am in a weird position in the fact that I don't recommend the Logitech Cloud at its current price point. However, if you do happen to buy it and it's within your budget, I think you might actually really enjoy it like I did. I feel like I got my money's worth out of the $350 I spent on it, and so if you can get it for anything less than that, if you have a similar use case to me, then you might really enjoy it. That being said, if you're willing to kind of look out for sales and kind of grab it at around that $200 price point, it's going to be an even better deal. All the same, there are still a lot of options out there, especially when it comes to Android-based handhelds. In fact, in my last video when I was talking about the Retroid Pocket 4, I made this fancy little graphic right here that kind of had a spectrum when it came to playing PlayStation 2 and GameCube games and the power to performance that you'll get depending on the price. And as you can see, the Logitech Cloud didn't even make the cut, and that's because the price is just kind of preposterous for the performance that it can get. And by the way, if I had to sandwich the Logitech Cloud into this spectrum, I would put it somewhere between T618 and D900. So as you can see, a lot of the other devices that are within the same kind of power performance are around that $150 and $200 price point. And that's where I think the Logitech Cloud would really shine. So in the end, if you can find it at that price, yeah, I think it's totally worth it. All the same, if you do pick it up for a higher price point, you might really enjoy it as well. Anyway, that's it for this video. I'm still super conflicted about the Logitech G Cloud. It is a device that is still way too expensive, but something that I really enjoy, and I do feel like I've got my money's worth out of it. Anyway, if you have one of these, let me know your experience in the comments down below. Also, if you thought about picking one up and you haven't, let me know why you haven't as well. I'm really interested to just kind of hear what other people are thinking when it comes to this device. I personally love it, but I can totally understand why others don't. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.